Before we dive into this powerful story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. This journey will touch your heart in ways you never expected. Enjoy the story. My name is Theodore Whitmore, and I'm 70 years old. What I'm about to tell you happened just 6 months ago, and it changed everything I thought I knew about my life, my marriage, and my family. It started with something so innocent, a DNA test. My granddaughter Emma, she's 22 and always been curious about everything, bought me one of those ancestry kits for my birthday. "Come on, Grandpa Ted," she said with that smile that melts my heart. "Let's see if we're really Irish like Great-Grandma always claimed." I thought it was harmless fun. Spit in a tube, mail it off, wait 6 weeks, and find out about my Celtic roots. Simple, right? Margaret, my wife of 45 years, even laughed about it. "Maybe we'll discover you're actually Italian," she joked. "That would explain your love for pasta." The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning in March. Margaret had gone for her daily walk with the neighborhood ladies, something she'd done religiously for the past 15 years. I was alone in our kitchen, the same kitchen where we'd raised our 3 children, David, Sarah, and Michael. I opened that envelope, expecting to read about distant relatives in County Cork, or maybe some Viking ancestry. Instead, my world exploded. The report was clear, clinical, devastating, based on genetic analysis. Theodore Whitmore shows no paternal relationship to the tested individuals. David Whitmore, age 44, Sarah Whitmorchan, age 42, and Michael Whitmore, age 39. No paternal relationship. Those 3 words hit me like a freight train. I read it again, then again. My coffee grew cold as I stared at those results, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the paper. How was this possible? I was there when each of my children was born. I held them minutes after they took their first breaths. I changed their diapers, taught them to ride bikes, walked Sarah down the aisle just 5 years ago. The front door creaked, that familiar sound I'd heard thousands of times. Margaret's voice drifted from the hallway, humming the same tune she used to hum when she was pregnant with each of our babies. "Ted, I'm back. Mrs. Henderson's roses are absolutely gorgeous this year." She walked into the kitchen, her silver hair perfectly styled, cheeks rosy from her walk. Those green eyes I fell in love with in 1978, sparkling with contentment. Then she saw my face. "What's wrong?" she asked, her smile vanishing. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I looked at her, really looked at her. This woman I'd shared my entire adult life with. Margaret Elizabeth Morrison, who became Margaret Whitmore on a beautiful June day in 1979, the mother of my children, or so I thought. "Margaret," I whispered, my voice cracking like a teenage boy's. "We need to talk." Her eyes moved to the papers on the table, and in that instant, I saw something that chilled me to the bone. Recognition flickered across her face. Not confusion, not curiosity, recognition. She knew what those papers were before she even read them. My heart stopped. In 45 years of marriage, I'd learned to read my wife's expressions like a favorite book, and what I saw in her eyes at that moment told me everything I needed to know. She knew, dear God in heaven, she knew. The silence in that kitchen stretched like an eternity. Margaret stood frozen in the doorway, her purse still clutched in her hands, staring at those papers like they were on fire. I watched her face cycle through emotions, surprise, fear, and something that looked an awful lot like guilt. "Ted, what are those papers?" she asked, but her voice had changed. Gone was the cheerful tone from moments before. Now she sounded small, frightened. I stood up slowly, my 70-year-old knees protesting, and picked up the DNA results. My hands were still shaking as I held them out to her. "It's the ancestry test results, Margaret. The one Emma got me for my birthday." She didn't take the papers. Instead, she set her purse down on the counter with deliberate care, like she was buying time. "And did you find out about those Irish roots, Margaret?" I said her name like a prayer, like a plea. "According to this test, I'm not the biological father of any of our children." The words hung in the air between us like a death sentence. Margaret's face went white, whiter than I'd ever seen it, even when she had pneumonia 3 winters ago. She gripped the edge of the counter so hard her knuckles turned white. That's impossible," she whispered. "Those tests aren't always accurate. There must be a mistake." But even as she said it, I could see the truth in her eyes. In 45 years of marriage, you learn to read someone's soul. Margaret had always been a terrible liar. She'd turn red when she tried to surprise me for my birthday, stumble over her words when she spent too much on groceries. Now, she was lying about the most important thing in our entire lives. "Is it a mistake, Margaret?" I asked. My voice stronger now, fueled by a growing fire in my chest. "Because the lab tested all 3 of our children's DNA that Emma submitted along with mine. David, Sarah, and Michael, none of them share my DNA." She moved to the kitchen table and sat down heavily in her usual chair, the one facing the window, where she liked to watch the birds at our feeder. Her hands were trembling now, too. "There has to be an explanation," she said, but she wouldn't meet my eyes. Maybe there's something wrong with your DNA. Some condition that makes the test inaccurate." I sat down across from her, in the same spot where we'd eaten breakfast together nearly every morning for 4.5 decades. The same table where we'd helped our children with homework, where we'd planned family vacations, where we'd discussed our retirement dreams. "Margaret, look at me." When she finally raised her eyes, I saw tears beginning to form. "I need you to tell me the truth. Is there something you need to tell me about our children?" The tears spilled over then, running down her cheeks in streams. She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again. I watched my wife of 45 years struggle with words, and I felt something inside my chest crack. I don't know what you want me to say, Ted." Her voice was barely a whisper. "Those are our children, our babies. I gave birth to them. You were there. I was there for the births, yes. But were you there for the conceptions?" The question tore out of me before I could stop it, harsh and ugly in the morning light. Margaret flinched like I'd slapped her. She buried her face in her hands and began to sob, deep, wrenching sobs that shook her entire body. I'd seen her cry before, of course. When her mother died, when we lost our first pregnancy before David, when Michael broke his arm falling from that tree. But this was different. This was the sound of a woman carrying a burden too heavy for her soul. I wanted to comfort her. After 45 years together, my instinct was to reach across the table and take her hand. But I couldn't. Not yet. Not until I knew the truth. "Margaret," I said softly, "I love you. I've loved you since the day we met at that church social. But I need to know what happened. I need to understand how 3 children I raised, 3 children I would die for, don't share my blood." She looked up at me then, her makeup smeared, her eyes red and swollen. "You don't understand, Ted. It's not what you think." "Then help me understand, please." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, took a shaky breath, and for a moment, I thought she was going to tell me everything. But then she stood up abruptly, pushing her chair back so hard it nearly toppled over. "I can't do this right now," she said, her voice breaking. I need time to think. This is all wrong. Something's wrong with that test." She practically ran from the kitchen, leaving me alone with those damning papers and 1,000 questions that felt like they might kill me. That's when I knew my life as I'd known it was over. I sat in that empty kitchen for 2 hours, staring at those DNA results until the words blurred together. The house was silent except for the tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway. The same clock Margaret's father had given us as a wedding present. Everything around me felt like evidence of a life that might have been built on lies. Finally, I heard footsteps upstairs. Margaret was moving around in our bedroom, and I could hear drawers opening and closing. Part of me wondered if she was packing, if she was planning to run away from this conversation the way she'd run from the kitchen. When she came back downstairs, her face was washed, her hair combed, and she'd changed into her blue dress, the one she wore to church and important occasions. She was trying to armor herself with normalcy, but I could see the fear still swimming in her eyes. "Ted," she said, standing in the kitchen doorway like she was afraid to come closer. "I've been thinking upstairs, and I want you to know that I'm willing to get a second test done. A different lab. These home DNA kits aren't always reliable." I looked at my wife, this woman who'd shared my bed, my dreams, my entire adult life, and I felt like I was looking at a stranger. "Margaret, sit down, please." She hesitated, then slowly took her seat across from me. I reached across the table and took her hands in mine. They were ice cold. "Honey, I need you to stop talking about lab errors and listen to me. I've been sitting here for 2 hours, and I've been thinking about things. Things that didn't make sense at the time, but they're starting to make sense now." Her hands tensed in mine, but she didn't pull away. "Do you remember when we were trying to get pregnant with David? We'd been married almost 2 years, and nothing was happening. You were so worried, so upset about it." She nodded slowly, tears already forming again. "And then you went to visit your mother for 3 weeks. Remember? You said she was having health problems and needed help around the house. But when I called to check on you, your mother sounded fine, strong as ever, and you seemed different. When you came back, Ted, please don't, let me finish." My voice was firmer now. "You came back from that trip changed, quieter, and exactly 6 weeks later, you told me you were pregnant. You were so happy, but also, scared. I thought you were just nervous about becoming a mother." Margaret's face had gone white again. She tried to pull her hands away, but I held on gently. "Then there was the time when Sarah was 3 and Michael was just a baby. I came home early from work one day, and you were on the phone. You hung up quickly and said it was just a wrong number, but you looked terrified. And the caller ID said Morrison Medical. I asked you about it, and you said it was probably a marketing call. Ted, you're reading too much into, am I?" Leaned forward, studying her face. "Because I remember other things too. How you never wanted to talk about genetics when the kids were growing up. When David needed that blood type information for his sports physical, you seemed panicked until we found out his type. When Sarah had that genetic counseling before Emma was born, you found excuses not to go with her." The tears were flowing freely now, but Margaret wasn't sobbing. She was sitting perfectly still, like a deer caught in headlights. "And there's something else I remembered while I was sitting here alone. James Morrison." The moment I said that name, Margaret's entire body went rigid. Her face drained of what little color was left. "You remember James, don't you, Margaret, our old neighbor? Nice guy, friendly family, helped me fix the fence that summer David was born. And then, right after Michael was born, he and his wife packed up and moved away. Suddenly, no forwarding address. Do you remember what you said when I mentioned how strange it was?" She was staring at me like I was a ghost. "You said maybe they just needed a fresh start, somewhere new." But now I'm wondering, was James Morrison the reason you needed to visit your mother all those times when I thought you were having trouble getting pregnant? Stop. The word came out as a whisper, but it cut through the air like a scream. Please, Ted, stop. I can't stop, Margaret. I can't stop because for 45 years I've been living what I thought was my life, raising what I thought were my children, and now I find out it was all. I couldn't finish the sentence. She was crying harder now, her shoulders shaking. You don't understand, it WASN, single quotes, T, ... It wasn't like that. Then tell me what it was like. I reached across and lifted her chin so she had to look at me. Tell me the truth, Margaret. I deserve that much after 45 years. She looked into my eyes for a long moment, and I saw something break inside her. Her face crumpled, and she whispered words that shattered what was left of my world. It wasn't James, Ted. It was never James. The truth is so much worse than that. And then she started crying so hard I thought she might never stop. Margaret's words hung between us like a curse. It wasn't James. The truth is so much worse than that. I felt my heart hammering against my ribs as I watched my wife dissolve into tears that seemed to come from the depths of her soul. What you mean, it's worse? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. She couldn't speak through her sobs. So I got up and poured her a glass of water, then sat back down and waited. In all our years together, I'd learned that Margaret needed time to gather herself when she was truly upset. But this felt different. This felt like watching someone come apart at the seams. Finally, she wiped her eyes and took a shaky sip of water. Ted, I need to tell you something that I've kept buried for over 40 years. Something I swore I would never tell anyone, especially not you, Margaret, whatever it is. No. She held up her hand to stop me. Let me talk, because if I don't say it now, I never will. I nodded and waited, my stomach churning with dread. Do you remember 1978, right after we got married? I was working at Morrison Medical Center as a receptionist, of course. You worked there for almost 2 years. Dr. Morrison, James's older brother Richard, he ran the clinic. He was doing research on fertility treatments, experimental procedures that weren't widely available yet. He said he was helping couples who couldn't conceive naturally. She paused, staring out the window at the bird feeder, where a cardinal was pecking at seeds. When we'd been trying to get pregnant for over a year with no success, Dr. Morrison approached me. He said he had a new treatment that could help, but it was still he said he could help us for free, because I worked at the clinic and he trusted me to keep quiet about the procedures. My blood was starting to run cold. What kind of procedures? He said. He said it was artificial insemination with enhanced fertility drugs. He told me that some women needed help with the timing, with making sure everything lined up perfectly for conception. He made it sound so scientific, so medical. Margaret's voice was getting smaller, like she was disappearing into herself. He told me not to tell you, because men sometimes felt uncomfortable with medical intervention in conception. He said it would be our secret until I got pregnant, and then I could tell you it happened naturally. He said lots of couples did it. That way, I felt like I was falling down a dark hole. Margaret, what exactly did he do? I went to the clinic 3 times a month for 6 months. He would examine me, give me injections, and then she stopped, her whole body trembling. Ted, I thought he was using your sample for the artificial insemination. He said he'd collected it from you during a routine physical you'd had at the clinic. What physical? I never had a physical at Morrison Medical. She looked at me with eyes full of anguish. I know that now. I've known that for 40 years, but I buried it so deep I almost convinced myself it never happened. The room felt like it was spinning. Are you telling me that Dr. Morrison ... I don't know whose genetic material he used, Ted, but it wasn't yours. And after David was born, when I realized what had really happened, I was too scared and too ashamed to tell anyone. Then 2 years later, when we wanted another baby, I was terrified to go back to him, but I didn't know how to get pregnant any other way. I thought maybe there was something wrong with me. Dear God, Margaret, why didn't you tell me? Because I was 24 years old and scared out of my mind. Her voice cracked with pain. Because Dr. Morrison told me that if I ever said anything about the procedures, he would ruin both our reputations. Because I thought if you knew the truth, you'd leave me. Because by the time I understood what had really happened, I was holding David in my arms, and I loved him so much I couldn't bear the thought of losing him. I sat there trying to process what she was telling me. My wife hadn't had an affair. She'd been deceived, manipulated, possibly assaulted by a doctor who'd taken advantage of her trust and our desperation to have children. So all 3 times, all 3 times I went back to him. Each time he promised it would work. Each time he used whatever genetic material he had. I never saw it, never questioned it. I was young and naive, and I trusted him because he was a doctor. Margaret, what happened to Dr. Morrison? She looked at me with haunted eyes. He died in a car accident in 1985, right before Michael's first birthday. The clinic closed, and all the records were sealed or destroyed. James and his family moved away because of the scandal that came out after Richard's death. What scandal? It turned out Dr. Morrison had been running illegal fertility experiments for years, using genetic material from unknown donors, sometimes even his own, without patients' knowledge or consent. The medical board found evidence of dozens of cases, but most of the victims never came forward. The whole thing was quietly swept under the rug. I felt like I'd been punched in the chest. My wife hadn't betrayed me. She'd been victimized by a monster who'd stolen our chance at biological children and then died before he could face justice. Margaret, I whispered, reaching for her hands again. Why didn't you tell me when you found out the truth? Because by then we had 3 beautiful children who called you Daddy, and I couldn't bear to destroy that. I convinced myself that it didn't matter, that you were their real father in every way that counted. And you were, Ted. You are. As I looked at my wife's tear-stained face, I realized that everything I thought I knew about our story was wrong. But somehow, that made it even more complicated. The rest of that day passed like we were walking through thick fog. Margaret and I sat at that kitchen table for hours, with her telling me details I'm not sure I wanted to know, and me asking questions I wasn't sure I wanted answered. By evening, we were both emotionally drained. But something had shifted between us. She wasn't the cheating wife I'd imagined for those horrible hours after reading the DNA results. She was a victim, just like me. But that didn't make the situation any easier to handle. What are we going to tell the children? She asked as we sat in our living room that night, the TV on but neither of us watching it. I'd been wondering the same thing. David, Sarah, and Michael, they were grown adults with their own families now, their own lives. Did they deserve to know that the man they called Dad wasn't their biological father? Did they deserve to know their mother had been deceived by a predatory doctor? I don't know, I said honestly. Part of me thinks they have a right to know. But another part of me thinks ... what good would it do? Margaret was quiet for a long time. Finally, she said, I keep thinking about their children. Emma, little Jake, Sophie, what if they need medical information someday? What if there are genetic conditions we don't know about? That thought had been nagging at me too. Emma was 22 now, the same age Margaret had been when Dr. Morrison took advantage of her. If Emma decided to have children someday, she'll know the truth about her genetic background. "There's something else," Margaret said quietly. "I've been thinking about the other women. Dr. Morrison did this to dozens of people. Ted, that means David, Sarah, and Michael might have half-siblings out there they don't know about." The idea hit me like a truck. Somewhere out there might be other families dealing with the same devastating discovery we were facing. Other children who shared biological fathers with my kids but had no idea. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about all the moments that suddenly made sense. Sarah's artistic talent that neither Margaret nor I possessed. Michael's natural athleticism that seemed to come from nowhere. David's brilliant mathematical mind that had always puzzled us. We'd chalked it all up to genetic mysteries. But now I knew the truth was much more sinister. The next morning, I made a decision that surprised even me. I called David. "Dad, you're calling early, everything okay?" Hearing him call me Dad nearly broke my heart. This man I'd raised from infancy, taught to throw a baseball, walked through his first heartbreak. He had no idea that everything he thought he knew about his identity was wrong. "David, I need you, Sarah, and Michael to come over this weekend. There's something your mother and I need to discuss with all of you." "Is someone sick? You're scaring me." "No one's sick, son. But it's important. Can you call your sister and brother?" "Of course. Dad, are you sure you're okay? You sound ... different." Different. If only he knew how different everything was now. "We'll talk this weekend. I love you, David. I love you too, Dad." After I hung up, Margaret looked at me with wide eyes. "Are we really going to tell them?" "I think we have to. They're not children anymore, Margaret. They're adults, and they deserve to make their own decisions about this information." She nodded slowly. "You're right. I'm terrified of how they'll react." "So am I." The next few days crawled by. Margaret and I were polite to each other, even tender at times, but there was an awkwardness that hadn't been there in decades. We were both processing not just the revelation about our children, but what it meant for our marriage. I found myself studying old photo albums, looking at pictures of our kids growing up. There was David at 6, missing his front teeth and grinning at the camera. Sarah at 10, covered in paint after her first art class. Michael at 16, holding his first-place track trophy. In every photo, they looked happy, loved, secure. Had I failed them somehow by not being their biological father? Did it change the love I felt for them, or the pride I took in their accomplishments? Logic told me it shouldn't matter, but my heart was struggling to catch up with my head. Friday evening, Margaret was in the kitchen preparing for the family meeting, making enough food to feed an army, her way of dealing with stress. I was in my study, trying to figure out how to tell my children that their entire understanding of their origins was wrong. The doorbell rang, and I heard familiar voices in the hallway. Sarah had arrived with her husband Tom and their daughter, Emma, my granddaughter. Was she still my granddaughter? Of course she was. Biology doesn't define love. Grandpa Ted. Emma's voice filled the house as she ran to find me. When she appeared in my study doorway, I saw Margaret's green eyes looking back at me, and I felt a stab of something I couldn't quite name. "Hey there, sweetheart." I hugged her tight, breathing in the scent of her shampoo, the same kind Sarah had used at that age. "Mum and Dad are worried about you," she said. "They think you and Grandma Margaret are getting divorced." The innocence of her words, the casual way she mentioned divorce, made me realize how much our family's world was about to change. "We're not getting divorced, Emma. but we do need to have a family conversation tonight. Is it about the DNA test? Mom told me you were upset about the results. I looked into my granddaughter's young face and wondered if I was about to destroy her sense of security the way mine had been destroyed just 1 week ago. Something like that, sweetheart. Why don't you go help Grandma Margaret in the kitchen? As Emma skipped away, I heard more voices. David and Michael had arrived with their families. Soon, our small house would be filled with the people I loved most in the world, and I would have to find a way to tell them that everything they thought they knew about their family was built on lies and medical crimes. I took a deep breath and headed toward the living room, knowing that in a few hours all of our lives would be changed forever. The living room had never felt so small. David sat on the couch with his wife Jennifer, their 10-year-old son, Jake, curled up beside his father. Sarah and Tom were in the matching chairs, with Emma cross-legged on the floor at their feet. Michael and his wife Lisa had pulled in chairs from the dining room, and their 6-year-old daughter, Sophie, was playing quietly with her dolls in the corner. Margaret and I stood at the front of the room like we were about to give a presentation, which, in a way, I suppose we were. The most important and devastating presentation of our lives. "Mum, Dad, you're both acting really strange," Sarah said, her artist's eye picking up on details others might miss. "Is everything okay?" I looked at Margaret, and she gave me a small nod. We'd agreed that I would do most of the talking, at least at first. "Kids, what I'm about to tell you is going to be difficult to hear, and it's going to change some things about how you understand our family. But I want you to know, before I say anything else, that my love for each of you hasn't changed and never will change." The adults in the room were all leaning forward now, alert and concerned. Jake had stopped fidgeting and was looking at me with wide eyes. "A few weeks ago, Emma convinced me to take a DNA ancestry test, you know, to find out about our Irish roots." I tried to smile at my granddaughter, but it felt forced. The results came back last Tuesday, and they contained some unexpected information. "What kind of unexpected information?" David asked. He'd always been the analytical one, the problem solver. I took a deep breath. "The test showed that I'm not the biological father of any of you." The silence that followed was deafening. I watched as the words sank in, as my children's faces went through a series of emotions: confusion, disbelief, shock. "That's impossible," Michael said flatly. "Those home DNA kits aren't accurate. Everyone knows that." "That's what we thought at first too," Margaret said quietly. "But we've done some research, and the test results are reliable." "I don't understand," Sarah said, her voice small. "Are you saying Mum had an affair?" "No," I said quickly. "Your mother did not have an affair. She was deceived by someone in a position of trust." Over the next hour, Margaret and I told them the story. We explained about Dr. Morrison, about the fertility clinic, about the experimental procedures that were actually criminal acts. We watched our children process the information, saw them struggle with the same emotions Margaret and I had been wrestling with all week. David was the first to speak when we finished. "So, you're telling us that some doctor we never met is our biological father. We don't know if it was Dr. Morrison himself, or if he used other genetic material," Margaret said. "The records were destroyed when he died, and the clinic was shut down. But we might have half-siblings out there," Sarah said, her voice hollow. "Other children from his experiments." "It's possible," I admitted. Emma, who had been sitting quietly through the entire explanation, suddenly spoke up. "But Grandpa, Ted is still our grandpa, right? This doesn't change that." The innocence of her question, The way she cut right to the heart of what mattered made my throat tight with emotion. "Absolutely, sweetheart. I'm still your grandpa, and I always will be." "Good," she said simply. "Because I don't want a different grandpa." But not everyone was handling it as well as Emma. Michael stood up abruptly, his face flushed with anger. "This is insane," he said. "You're telling us our entire lives are based on a lie, that we don't know who we really are." "You know exactly who you are," I said firmly. "You're Michael Whitmore, you're my son, and you're the same person you were yesterday before you knew any of this. But I'm not, am I?" His voice cracked with emotion. "I'm the son of some psychopath doctor who assaulted Mum and used his own genetic material to create me. That's who I really am." "Michael, stop," Sarah said. "That's not who you are." "How do you know?" He turned to her, his eyes blazing. "How do any of us know anything anymore?" Lisa reached for her husband's hand. "Honey, sit down. Let's talk about this calmly." "I don't want to talk about it calmly," Michael exploded. "I want to know why you two kept this secret for 40 years. I want to know what else you've been lying about." "We haven't been lying about anything else," Margaret said, tears starting to flow again. "I was 24 years old and scared, and by the time I understood what had really happened, you were all here, and you were ours, and I couldn't bear to what? To tell us the truth. To risk losing you," she whispered. The room fell silent again. I could see the war happening in my children's faces, the battle between the love they'd always felt for Margaret and me, and the betrayal they were experiencing now. David, ever the peacemaker, finally spoke. "Dad, Mom, we need some time to process this. It's a lot, of course," I said. "Take all the time you need." "But I need to ask you something," Sarah said quietly. "Are you going to stay together? Are you and Mum okay?" Margaret and I looked at each other. It was a fair question, and one we'd been avoiding all week. "We're working through it," I said honestly. "We love each other, and we love all of you. That hasn't changed." As the family began to gather their things to leave, Emma came over and hugged me tight. "I love you, Grandpa Ted. No matter what some stupid test says." But as I watched my children file out of the house, their faces still shell-shocked and confused, I wondered if our family would ever be the same again. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I wondered if telling them the truth had been the right thing to do after all. The week after our family meeting was the longest of my life. Margaret and I moved around each other like ghosts, both of us waiting for phone calls that didn't come. David, Sarah, and Michael had all said they needed time to process, but the silence was killing us. I found myself sitting in my study for hours, staring at the phone, willing it to ring. Margaret was doing the same thing in the kitchen, jumping every time her cell phone buzzed with a text message, only to have her face fall when it was just a telemarketer or a reminder about a doctor's appointment. On Thursday morning, exactly 1 week after our devastating family meeting, Sarah finally called. "Dad," her voice was small, uncertain. "Can we talk? Just you and me." "Of course, sweetheart. Do you want to come over? Actually, could you meet me at Morrison Park? I'm there with Emma, and she's playing on the swings." Morrison Park. The irony wasn't lost on me. The park was named after the same family that had torn our lives apart. But it had always been Sarah's favorite place when she was little. Some of my happiest memories were of pushing her on those same swings 35 years ago. When I arrived, I spotted Sarah immediately. She was sitting on a bench, watching Emma play, but I could see the tension in her shoulders even from a distance. Emma waved at me enthusiastically and went back to her swings, giving Sarah and me the privacy we needed. "How are you holding up?" I asked as I sat down beside her. I don't know, she said honestly. I keep thinking I should feel different somehow, like I should look in the mirror and see a stranger. But I don't. I still feel like me. You are you, Sarah. That hasn't changed. But it has changed, hasn't it? She turned to look at me, and I saw Margaret's green eyes filled with confusion and pain. Every time I look at Emma, I wonder what genetic surprises might be hiding in her DNA. Every time Tom and I talk about having another baby, I think about all the medical history I don't know. That was something I'd been wrestling with too. The practical implications of not knowing our children's biological heritage went far beyond hurt feelings and identity crises. I've been doing some research, I said carefully, about genetic testing and family medical history. There are ways to get information about potential health risks, even without knowing who the biological father is. That's not really the point, is it? Sarah sighed. It's not just about medical history. It's about ... belonging. About knowing where you come from. I watched Emma on the swings, her long hair flying behind her as she pumped her legs, trying to go higher. She looked so much like Sarah at that age, but now I wondered if she also looked like someone I'd never met, some anonymous donor, or maybe even the monster who'd deceived Margaret. Sarah, can I ask you something? Sure. Do you wish we hadn't told you? She was quiet for a long time, watching Emma play. I don't know, she finally said. Part of me wishes I could go back to not knowing. But another part of me thinks I deserved to know the truth. Your mother is convinced we did the wrong thing by telling you, kids. She thinks we should have kept the secret, and what do you think? I considered the question carefully. I think 40 years of lies was enough. I think you deserved better than that, even if the truth is painful. Sarah reached over and took my hand. Her fingers were paint-stained. As always, some things never changed. Dad, can I tell you something? Anything. The night after you told us, I went home and looked through all my old photo albums. Every birthday, every Christmas, every school play, you were there for all of it. You taught me to ride my bike. You came to every art show, even the terrible ones in middle school. You walked me down the aisle at my wedding. I felt my throat getting tight. Those are some of my favorite memories. Mine too. And looking at those pictures, I realized something. You might not be my biological father, but you're my dad. That's not the same thing, and I think maybe that's okay. We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching Emma play. Finally, Sarah spoke again. Have you heard from David or Michael? Not yet. How are they doing? David's angry, but he's processing it in his logical way. He's actually been researching Dr. Morrison, trying to find out more about what happened. Michael ... double quotes, she paused. Michael's not handling it well. Lisa's worried about him. That didn't surprise me. Michael had always been the most emotional of our children. The one who felt things most deeply. In some ways, he was the most like Margaret. What about Emma? I asked. How much does she understand? More than I'd like, but less than she thinks. She knows that you're not her biological grandfather, but she doesn't really understand what that means yet. She just knows she loves you. I love her too. More than I can express. Dad, can I ask you something else? Of course. Are you and Mum going to be okay? It was the second time one of my children had asked me that question, and I still didn't have a good answer. I hope so, sweetheart. We're trying to work through it, but it's complicated. 45 years of marriage is a long time to discover that such a fundamental part of your story was different than you thought. But you know, Mum was a victim in this too, right? She didn't choose this. I know that. My head knows that. My heart is still catching up. Sarah squeezed my hand. She loves you, Dad. She's loved you for 45 years. That's not fake, even if the circumstances of how we came to be were. As I drove home from the park, I felt a little lighter than I had in days. Sarah's acceptance meant everything to me, and knowing that she still saw me as her father helped heal something that had been broken inside me. But I also knew that not all of my children were going to handle this as gracefully as Sarah was, and until Michael and David were okay, our family couldn't begin to heal. That evening, Margaret was waiting for me in the kitchen when I got home. "How's Sarah?" she asked. "She's going to be okay. She's still processing, but she's going to be okay." Margaret's shoulders sagged with relief. "Thank God, I've been so worried." "Margaret, we need to talk about Michael. Sarah says he's not handling this well. I know Lisa called me this afternoon. She's scared, Ted. She says he's not sleeping, barely eating. He's obsessing over Dr. Morrison, trying to find information about him online. Maybe that's his way of processing it. Or maybe he's going to drive himself crazy, trying to find answers that don't exist." I reached across the table and took her hand the first time. I'd initiated physical contact since this whole nightmare began. "We'll get through this, Margaret, all of us. We just need time." But even as I said the words, I wondered if time would be enough to heal the wounds that had been opened. And I couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was still yet to come. 3 days after my conversation with Sarah in the park, I was sitting in my study when I heard Margaret gasp from the kitchen. She'd been going through old papers, trying to piece together memories from the Morrison medical days, when she called out to me in a voice I'd never heard before. Ted, come here. I found something." I hurried to the kitchen to find Margaret standing at the counter, holding what looked like an old manila envelope. Her hands were shaking, and her face was white as a sheet. "What is it?" I was going through that box of old documents from the attic, the one with our early medical records and marriage certificate, and I found this. She held up the envelope. It was stuck to the bottom of the box. I'd never seen it before. The envelope was yellowed with age and had M. Whitmore, Confidential, written across the front in faded blue ink. Inside were several pages of what looked like medical forms and a handwritten letter. "Read it," Margaret whispered. "Read it out loud." I took the letter with trembling hands. The handwriting was neat but hurried, as if someone had been writing quickly. "Dear Mrs. Whitmore," I began. "If you are reading this, then something has happened to me, and you deserve to know the truth about the procedures you underwent at my clinic. I have been carrying the weight of what I've done for too long, and my conscience will no longer allow me to remain silent." I stopped reading and looked at Margaret. "This is from Dr. Morrison." She nodded, tears already streaming down her face. "Keep reading. The fertility treatments I provided to you and dozens of other women were not what I claimed them to be. I told you I was using genetic material from your husband, but that was a lie. I was conducting unauthorized experiments using genetic material from multiple unknown donors, and in many cases, including yours, I used my own genetic material." The letter fell from my hands like it was on fire. Margaret caught it and continued reading in a voice barely above a whisper. "I convinced myself I was helping couples who couldn't conceive naturally, but I know now that what I did was wrong. It was criminal. I violated your trust, your body, and your marriage in ways that cannot be forgiven. Your children, David, Sarah, and Michael, they are biologically mine. I am their father, and that knowledge has been destroying me for years." The kitchen fell silent, except for the sound of Margaret's quiet sobs. I felt like the floor had disappeared beneath my feet. Dr. Morrison hadn't just used random genetic material, he had fathered my children himself. There's more, Margaret said, wiping her eyes. I sealed this letter and others like it in 1983, with instructions that they be delivered to my victims if anything should happen to me. I don't know why they were never sent. Perhaps my brother James couldn't bring himself to destroy so many lives with the truth. But you deserve to know who your children's biological father is, even if that man is me. The letter is signed, Margaret said, her voice hollow. Richard Morrison, M.D., June 15, 1983. I sank into a kitchen chair, my legs suddenly unable to support me. He knew all those years, he knew what he'd done, and he never said anything. Ted, there's something else in the envelope. Margaret pulled out what looked like a medical chart with 3 columns of information. At the top, it read, Whitmore, Children, Genetic Profile Documentation. It's a record of the procedures, she said. Dates, genetic markers, everything. He documented his crimes. I stared at the papers scattered across our kitchen table. For over a week, we'd been living with the uncertainty of not knowing who had fathered our children. Now we knew, and somehow that knowledge felt even worse than the mystery had. Margaret, this means that David, Sarah, and Michael aren't just products of medical fraud. They're the biological children of the man who assaulted you. She was crying harder now, her whole body shaking with the weight of this revelation. How do I tell them this, Ted? How do I look at my children and tell them their biological father was the monster who violated their mother? I got up and put my arms around her, holding her as she sobbed against my chest. In that moment, I realized that my anger toward Margaret, the lingering resentment I'd been carrying about being deceived, was completely gone. She hadn't just been victimized by Dr. Morrison. She'd been carrying the burden of his crimes for 40 years. We don't have to tell them, I said quietly. This doesn't change anything about who they are or how much we love them. But they have a right to know, don't they? Especially if there are medical implications. And what about all the other children? This letter suggests there were others. I looked down at the medical chart again, and something caught my eye. At the bottom of the page, there was a list of dates and initials, dozens of them, spanning from 1978 to 1985. Margaret, look at this. She pulled away from me and looked where I was pointing. Those are all his other victims, she said. All the other families he destroyed. That's not what I'm looking at. Look at the dates for our children. I pointed to 3 specific entries. David, March 1979, Sarah, April 1981, Michael, June 1983. What about them? The letter is dated June 15, 1983. Michael was born in March 1984. Margaret, Dr. Morrison wrote this confession letter right around the time he was assaulting you for the 3rd time. The implications hit us both at the same moment. Dr. Morrison had known exactly what he was doing when he conceived Michael. He'd already written his confession about David and Sarah, acknowledging his crimes, and then he'd done it again anyway. He was planning to come clean, Margaret whispered, but he couldn't stop himself. I felt a rage building inside me, unlike anything I'd ever experienced. This man hadn't just deceived my wife once in a moment of weakness or poor judgment. He'd systematically abused her trust 3 separate times over 5 years. Fathering 3 children while knowing exactly how wrong his actions were. Ted, what are we going to do with this information? Before I could answer, the phone rang. Margaret and I looked at each other, both of us still too shocked to move. Finally, I answered it. Hello, Dad. It was David's voice, but he sounded strange, excited, but also disturbed. Dad, I need to talk to you and Mum. I've been doing research on Dr. Morrison, and I found something. Something big. I looked at Margaret, then at the damning evidence spread across our kitchen table. What did you find, son? I found other victims, Dad, other families like us. And I think some of them want to meet. David arrived at our house within an hour, carrying his laptop and a thick folder of printed documents. When he walked into the kitchen and saw the papers Margaret and I had spread across the table, he stopped dead in his tracks. "What is all this?" he asked, setting down his laptop. Margaret and I exchanged glances. We'd spent the hour before his arrival debating whether to show him Dr. Morrison's confession letter. The decision had just been made for us. "Sit down, son," I said. "We need to show you something." As David read through Dr. Morrison's letter, I watched his face go through the same emotional journey Margaret and I had experienced. Disbelief, anger, disgust, and finally, a kind of hollow acceptance. "So, he wasn't just some anonymous donor," David said when he finished reading. "He was the doctor himself, the man who... He couldn't finish the sentence. "Yes," Margaret said, quietly, "Richard Morrison is your biological father. Yours, Sarah's, and Michael's." David set the letter down carefully, as if it might explode. "This changes everything, does it?" I asked. "You're still the same person you were an hour ago." "But I'm not, am I?" David ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I'd seen him make since he was a little boy. "I'm the son of a predator, a criminal. Someone who hurt women for his own sick purposes." "You're the son of the man who raised you," I said firmly. "Biology doesn't define character, David, you're proof of that." He was quiet for a long time, staring at the medical charts. Finally, he looked up at us with something that looked almost like relief in his eyes. "Actually, Dad, this might be good news." "Good news?" Margaret asked incredulously. "What I came here to tell you. I found a support group online for people who've discovered their products of fertility fraud. There are dozens of us, all over the country, all victims of doctors like Morrison who used their own genetic material without consent." David opened his laptop and pulled up a website. "This group has been working to identify other victims and help people find their half-siblings. When I contacted them and told them about Dr. Morrison and his clinic in Millbrook, they got very excited." "Why?" I asked. "Because there have been rumors about Morrison for years, but no one could ever prove anything. The clinic records were supposed to be destroyed, and Morrison died before anyone could investigate properly. But now, with his confession letter and these medical charts, we have proof." Margaret was shaking her head. "David, I don't want this to become public. I don't want to be the poster child for fertility fraud. Mum, you don't understand. There are other women out there who went through the same thing you did. Women who have been carrying this secret and this shame for decades, just like you have. This could help them." He pulled up a message board on the website. "Look at this. These are posts from people trying to find information about Morrison Medical Center in Millbrook. There are at least 15 different people here who think they might be Morrison's biological children." I read over his shoulder. The posts were heartbreaking. People describing the same confusion and identity crisis we'd been experiencing. All of them searching for answers about their origins. "One woman here," David said, pointing to a post. "She's 52 years old and just found out, through DNA testing, that her father isn't her biological parent. Her mother went to Morrison's clinic in 1971. That's before your mother even worked there," I said. "Exactly. Morrison was doing this for over a decade. There could be dozens of his biological children out there." Margaret looked overwhelmed. "I can't handle the thought of meeting other women who went through what I did. I can't face that." "You don't have to," David said gently. "But maybe I could meet some of my potential half-siblings. Maybe Sarah and Michael could too, if they want to. Have you told your brother and sister about this?" "Not yet. I wanted to talk to you first." "But Dad, there's something else." David scrolled down to another post on the message board. "This woman lives just 2 hours away from here. She's 43 years old, which would make her close to Sarah's age. Her name is Jennifer Caldwell, and she's pretty sure Morrison is her biological father to her." He pulled up a photo that had been posted with the message. The woman had dark hair and green eyes, and there was something about her features that looked familiar. "My God," Margaret whispered. "She looks like Sarah." "That's what I thought too. And look at this." David showed us another photo, this one, of a man about his own age. "This is Robert Chen, not related to Sarah's husband Tom, just a coincidence with the last name. He's 44, lives in Michigan, and he's been trying to find information about Morrison for 3 years. The resemblance was less obvious than with the woman, but there was something about the man's bone structure, the shape of his eyes, that reminded me of David." "How many people are in this group?" I asked. "The main support group has over 300 members from all over the country, but the Morrison-specific thread only has about 20 people so far. The moderator thinks that once word gets out that we have actual documentation from Morrison, more people will come forward." I sat back in my chair, trying to process what David was telling us. In the span of a few hours, we'd gone from having 3 children to potentially having dozens of stepchildren scattered across the country, all of them products of the same medical crimes. "David, what do you want to do with this information?" "I want to meet them," he said without hesitation. "I want to meet Jennifer Caldwell and Robert Chen and anyone else who might be my half-sibling. I've spent my entire life thinking I was an only child in terms of biology, and now I find out I might have a huge extended family I never knew about. What about Sarah and Michael? That's up to them. But I think they deserve to know this option exists." Margaret was looking at the photos on David's laptop with an expression I couldn't quite read. "These people, they're all carrying the same burden I've been carrying, the same shame and confusion. Mum, none of you should feel ashamed. You were all victims. I know that intellectually, but emotionally." Double quotes, she trailed off, then looked at me. "Ted, what do you think? Should we reach out to these people?" I looked at my son, this man I'd raised to be curious, compassionate, and brave, and I realized that this was his decision to make. I think David should do whatever feels right to him. Same with Sarah and Michael. David nodded and started typing on his laptop. "I'm going to message Jennifer Caldwell. I want to see if she'd be willing to meet." As I watched my son reach out to a stranger who might be his half-sister, I realized that our family story was about to become much bigger and more complicated than any of us had imagined. 2 days later, we were sitting in a coffee shop in the small town of Riverside, exactly halfway between our home and where Jennifer Caldwell lived. David had insisted that Margaret and I come with him for this first meeting. And despite her initial reluctance, Margaret had agreed. "I still can't believe we're doing this," Margaret said nervously, stirring her coffee for the 4th time. "We don't have to stay long," I assured her. "If it feels wrong or uncomfortable, we can leave any time." David was checking his phone constantly, watching for a text from Jennifer. They'd exchanged several messages over the past 2 days, sharing photos and basic information. The resemblance to Sarah was even more striking in the additional photos Jennifer had sent. "There," David said suddenly, looking toward the door. "I think that's her." The woman who walked in was unmistakably related to our family. She had Sarah's green eyes, Margaret's bone structure, and something about her posture that reminded me of both my wife and daughter. She was scanning the coffee shop nervously, clearly as anxious about this meeting as we were. David stood up and waved. Jennifer smiled, Sarah smiled, and walked over to our table. David, yes, and these are my parents, Theodore and Margaret Whitmore. As Jennifer sat down, I found myself staring at her, looking for more resemblances to my children. It was unsettling and fascinating at the same time. I have to say, Jennifer said, her voice slightly shaky, this is the strangest conversation I've ever had, but also maybe the most important. How long have you known? Margaret asked quietly. About Morrison being my biological father. Only about 6 months. I did one of those DNA tests to find relatives for a family tree project, and it showed that my dad wasn't my biological parent. My mum finally told me the truth about the fertility treatments she received in 1981. 1981, Margaret repeated. Sarah was conceived in 1981. Jennifer nodded. I saw Sarah's information in David's messages. We're only 3 months apart in age. We might have been conceived within weeks of each other. The thought sent a chill through me. While Margaret was carrying Sarah, another woman was carrying Jennifer, both of them victims of the same predator. Has your mother? How is she handling all this? Margaret asked. Jennifer's expression grew sad. Not well. She's been carrying the shame and confusion for over 40 years, just like you have. She refuses to talk about it with anyone except me, and even then, only barely. That's exactly how I feel, Margaret said. Like I did something wrong, even though I know logically that I was the victim. Did your mother ever suspect? David asked. She says no, but looking back, she remembers things that should have been red flags. Morrison told her the same story he told your mum, that he was using genetic material from my dad. But he also told her not to tell my father about the specific procedures, because men sometimes felt uncomfortable with medical intervention. He used the exact same script, I said, word for word, which means he'd done this before and refined his approach. Jennifer pulled out her own folder of documents. I've been researching too, and I found records of at least 12 other women who received fertility treatments from Morrison between 1978 and 1985. 12 that you know of. David said there could be more. Jennifer opened her folder and pulled out a printed spreadsheet. I've been trying to track down the other potential victims and their children. So far, I've made contact with 8 people who believe Morrison is their biological father. She slid the spreadsheet across the table. It was a list of names, ages, locations, and contact information. As I scanned the list, I felt overwhelmed by the scope of Morrison's crimes. Robert Chen, the man I told you about, is driving down from Michigan tomorrow, David said. He wants to meet all of us. And there's something else, Jennifer said. Something I didn't want to put in a message. One of the people I've been in contact with is Dr. Patricia Kellerman. She's a geneticist who specializes in fertility fraud cases. Why is that significant? I asked. Because she's also Morrison's biological daughter. She was born in 1978. And she's been trying to build a database of his victims and their children for years. She thinks there might be a way to get justice, even though Morrison is dead. Margaret looked up sharply. What kind of justice? My estate was never properly settled because of the investigations after his death. Dr. Kellerman believes that if we can document enough cases and prove the scope of his crimes, we might be able to file a class action lawsuit against his estate and the medical group that allowed him to operate. The idea of dragging our family's trauma through a legal battle made my stomach churn. But I could see the appeal for other victims who might not have had the stable, loving family life our children had experienced. There's more, Jennifer continued. Dr. Kellerman has been in contact with a documentary filmmaker who specializes in medical ethics cases. They want to tell our story, to expose what Morrison did and help other fertility fraud victims come forward. Absolutely not, Margaret said immediately. I won't have our family's private pain turned into entertainment. It wouldn't be entertainment, David said gently. It would be education. Think about how many other families might be out there, dealing with the same confusion and pain we've experienced, with no idea what really happened to them. I looked around the table at these three people, my wife, my son, and a woman who might be my stepdaughter, and realized that our small family crisis had become something much larger. We weren't just dealing with our own pain anymore. We were part of a community of victims that stretched across decades and state lines. Jennifer, I said, this Dr. Kellerman, when can we meet her? She's actually here, Jennifer said, glancing toward the door. I asked her to come, but to wait until we'd had a chance to talk first. She's been sitting in her car in the parking lot for the past hour. Margaret's eyes widened. You brought Morrison's daughter here, without asking us. I'm sorry, I should have told you. But she's not just Morrison's daughter, she's one of us. She's a victim too, and she's devoted her life to helping other victims find answers. David was already standing up. I want to meet her. As I watched my son walk toward the door to invite Dr. Kellerman inside, I realized that we'd reached a point of no return. Our family's private trauma was about to become part of something much bigger, and I wasn't sure any of us were prepared for what that might mean. Dr. Patricia Kellerman was a small woman in her mid-40s with graying hair and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. When she walked into the coffee shop with David, I could see the family resemblance immediately. She had the same bone structure as Jennifer and Sarah, the same nose as Michael. Thank you for agreeing to meet with me, she said as she sat down at our table. I know this is overwhelming for all of you. It was overwhelming for me too when I first learned the truth about my conception. How long have you known? Margaret asked. About 15 years. I was doing genetic research for my doctoral dissertation and decided to test my own DNA as part of the study. When the results showed my father wasn't my biological parent, my mother finally told me about the fertility treatments she'd received from Richard Morrison. Margaret leaned forward. How did your mother know him? She didn't, initially. She was referred to his clinic by her gynecologist when she and my dad had trouble conceiving. She went through the exact same procedures you did. The lies about using genetic material from her husband, the secrecy, the manipulation. Dr. Kellerman pulled out a tablet and opened what looked like a family tree diagram, but instead of showing marriages and children, it showed Morrison's victims and their offspring. Over the past 15 years, I've documented 47 confirmed cases of fertility fraud committed by Richard Morrison. That represents 73 children who are biologically his offspring. Spanning from 1971 to 1985, the numbers were staggering. I found myself looking at the diagram, trying to process the idea that David, Sarah, and Michael had dozens of half-siblings they'd never met. How many of them know the truth? David asked. About half. The others are still living with the secret, either because their mothers never told them, or because they haven't done DNA testing yet. But as these ancestry tests become more popular, more people are discovering discrepancies and starting to ask questions. Jennifer was studying the diagram. Are there others like us who are meeting each other? Yes, there's a group of 8 Morrison siblings who get together every year for a reunion of sorts. They call themselves the Morrison 73, a reference to the total number of his biological children. They've become incredibly close, like a real family. Margaret looked troubled. I don't think I could handle that. Meeting all these people, being constantly reminded of what happened. You don't have to, Dr. Kellerman said gently. Every family handles this differently. Some of the mothers, like you, prefer to stay private. Others have become advocates for legislative changes to prevent fertility fraud. There's no right or wrong way to process this. What about the legal aspects? I asked. Jennifer mentioned something about a lawsuit. Dr. Kellerman nodded. Morrison's estate was frozen after his death because of the initial investigations, but it was never properly resolved. There's still significant assets, properties, investments, insurance money. If we can document enough cases and prove the pattern of criminal behavior, we might be able to pursue compensation for his victims. What kind of compensation could possibly make up for this? Margaret asked bitterly. You're right, no amount of money can undo the trauma, but it could help pay for therapy, medical monitoring, genetic counseling, practical things that families need when they're dealing with the aftermath of fertility fraud. David was scrolling through something on his phone. Dr. Kellerman, I've been researching Morrison since we learned the truth, and I found something strange. There are references to other doctors who worked with him, other clinics that might have been involved. Was this bigger than just one man? Dr. Kellerman's expression grew serious. That's a very good question, and it's one I've been investigating for years. Morrison had a network of colleagues who referred patients to him, and there's evidence that some of them knew what he was doing. What kind of evidence? Medical records that show unusual patterns in referrals, correspondence between doctors, that suggests they were aware of Morrison's methods, financial records that indicate he was paying referral fees that were well above normal rates. Jennifer looked shocked. Are you saying other doctors were helping him find victims? I'm saying it's possible. And if that's true, then the scope of this crime is much larger than any of us imagined. The coffee shop suddenly felt too small, too public for this conversation. I glanced around and realized that other customers were starting to look at our table curiously, probably wondering why a group of adults was having such an intense conversation. Dr. Kellerman, I said, this is a lot to process. Can you give us some time to discuss this as a family? Of course, but there's one more thing I need to tell you before I go. She reached into her bag and pulled out a thick manila envelope. This contains DNA test results for 12 of Morrison's biological children, including myself. If David, Sarah, or Michael decide they want to confirm their connection to the rest of us, these results can serve as a comparison. David took the envelope. How accurate would that be? Extremely accurate. The genetic markers for Morrison's children are very distinctive. If your siblings match our DNA profile, there's no question about paternity. After Dr. Kellerman left, the four of us sat in silence for several minutes. Finally, Jennifer spoke. I know this is incredibly overwhelming, but I want you to know how much it means to me to finally meet some of my biological siblings. I've felt so alone with this knowledge. You're not alone, David said. Whatever we decide to do going forward, you're not alone. Margaret was staring out the window, lost in thought. Ted, I keep thinking about what she said about other doctors being involved. What if this goes beyond Morrison? What if there are other victims out there who don't even know what happened to them? It was a terrifying thought, but one that had been nagging at me, too. If Morrison had been part of a larger network of doctors committing fertility fraud, then the 73 children Dr. Kellerman had documented might be just the tip of the iceberg. As we drove home that evening, I realized that our family's story had become part of something much bigger and more complex than I'd ever imagined. and I wasn't sure whether that made me feel better or worse about what we were facing. The next morning, I woke up to find Margaret sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee, staring at a letter she'd written by hand. "What's that?" I asked, pouring myself a cup. "I've been up since 4 o'clock, writing to Sarah and Michael, trying to figure out how to tell them about yesterday, about Jennifer and Dr. Kellerman, and everything we learned." I sat down beside her and read over her shoulder. The letter was careful, loving, but I could see the pain in every word. "Maybe we should call them instead of writing," I suggested. "I tried calling Michael 3 times yesterday after we got home. Lisa says he's still not ready to talk to us. And Sarah ... I don't know how to tell her that she has a half-sister who looks exactly like her." Before I could respond, the doorbell rang. It was only 7 in the morning, too early for normal visitors. I opened the door to find Michael standing on our porch, unshaven and exhausted looking, but more composed than the last time I'd seen him. "Can I come in?" he asked. "Of course, son. Your mother's in the kitchen." Margaret's face lit up when she saw Michael, then immediately clouded with worry. "Sweetheart, are you okay? Lisa said you didn't want to talk to us. I needed time to process everything. But then David called me last night and told me about the meeting yesterday. About Jennifer Caldwell and Dr. Kellerman." He sat down heavily, in a kitchen chair. "I need to know everything. All of it." Over the next hour, Margaret and I told Michael about the previous day's revelations. We showed him Dr. Kellerman's diagram of Morrison's victims, Jennifer's research, and the DNA test results that could confirm his biological connection to dozens of half-siblings. Michael listened without interrupting, his expression cycling through emotions I recognized from my own journey through this nightmare. When we finished, he was quiet for a long time. "So we're not just dealing with our own family anymore," he finally said. "We're part of a community of victims that spans decades." "That's one way to look at it," I said. "How else should I look at it?" "You could look at it as finding a larger family. David seems excited about the possibility of meeting his half-siblings." Michael laughed bitterly. "Of course David's excited. David sees this as a puzzle to solve, a mystery to unravel. That's how his mind works." "And how does your mind work?" Margaret asked gently. "My mind sees this as proof that my entire existence is based on a criminal act. That every day I'm alive is a reminder of what that monster did to you." Margaret reached across the table and took his hand. "Michael, what Morrison did to me was horrible, but it gave me you. You and David and Sarah. You 3 are the only good things that came out of that nightmare. But don't you see? That's exactly the problem. You can't separate us from what he did. Every time you look at us, you see his crimes." "That's not true." "It is true, Mum, and it's okay. I understand why this has been so hard for you to process." Michael pulled out his phone and showed us a text message. "This is from Robert Chen, the man David told me about. He's driving down from Michigan today, and he wants to meet all of us." "Are you going to meet him?" I asked. "I think I have to. I think I need to understand what it means to be part of this family, I guess, if that's what we are." The doorbell rang again, and this time it was Sarah, with Emma in tow. Emma ran to hug Michael while Sarah looked around at all of us gathered in the kitchen. "David called me too," she said. "He told me about yesterday. And he told me about Jennifer." "How are you feeling about all this?" Margaret asked. Sarah sat down, pulling Emma onto her lap. "Honestly, I'm terrified, but also curious. David showed me Jennifer's photo, and it's like looking at myself 20 years ago. She wants to meet you," I said. "Jennifer, I mean." She's hoping all three of you will be willing to connect with some of your half-siblings. Emma, Sarah said to her daughter, why don't you go watch TV in the living room for a little while? The grown-ups need to talk. After Emma left, Sarah turned back to us. I've been thinking about this all night, about what it means for Emma, for her future children. What if there are genetic conditions we don't know about? What if Morrison passed down something dangerous? Dr. Kellerman mentioned that she's been tracking medical information for Morrison's children, I said. She might be able to help with that. Michael was scrolling through something on his phone. There's something else we need to talk about. I've been researching Morrison's colleagues, the other doctors Dr. Kellerman mentioned, and I found something disturbing. He turned his phone around to show us a newspaper article from 1987. The headline read, "Second fertility doctor investigated for unauthorized procedures." This is about Dr. James Morrison, Richard's younger brother, our old neighbor. Margaret's face went white. But James was he was just a neighbor. He wasn't even a doctor. Yes, he was. He was a gynecologist who worked at Morrison Medical part-time while running his own practice. And according to this article, he was investigated for fertility fraud in 1987, 2 years after Richard died. I felt like the ground was shifting beneath my feet again. What happened with the investigation? Inconclusive. James Morrison left the state before it could be completed, and the investigation was dropped due to lack of evidence. Sarah was staring at the article. So the man who lived next door to us, who helped Dad fix our fence, who played with us as children, he might have been involved in Richard Morrison's crimes. It's possible, Michael said. And if he was, it means the network of people involved in this was even closer to our family than we realized. Margaret was crying again, but this time it was different. These weren't tears of shame or confusion, they were tears of rage. They were everywhere, she whispered. The people who hurt us were everywhere around us, and we never knew. As I looked around the kitchen at my wife and children, I realized that every revelation seemed to make our situation more complex, not less. We weren't just dealing with one criminal doctor anymore. We were potentially dealing with a network of medical professionals who had systematically victimized women for over a decade. And somewhere out there, Robert Chen was driving toward our house, hoping to meet his half-siblings and find some answers about his own origins. I wondered if we were ready to face whatever truths he might bring with him. Dr. Rachel Morrison Stevens arrived at Sarah's house at 4 o'clock, carrying 2 large briefcases and a laptop bag. She was a woman in her early 50s, with graying hair and tired eyes that held a mixture of determination and sadness. When she introduced herself, I could see traces of Richard Morrison in her features. But where his eyes had been predatory according to Margaret's descriptions, hers were kind. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me," she said as we settled in Sarah's living room. "I know this is incredibly difficult for all of you, and I want you to know that everything I'm about to share with you comes from a place of wanting justice for my father's victims." "How long have you known about what your father did?" Margaret asked. "I started suspecting something when I was in medical school in the early 1990s. Patients would sometimes make comments about remembering my father from fertility treatments, but the details they shared didn't match standard medical procedures. It took me years to piece together the truth." Dr. Morrison Stevens opened her first briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "What I'm about to show you is the result of 20 years of investigation. I want to warn you that some of these documents are disturbing, but I believe you have a right to see them." She spread several papers across Sarah's coffee table. The first was a financial ledger showing payments between multiple medical practices from 1968 to 1987. This shows the money trail between 8 different doctors across Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Maine. They were paying each other referral fees that were far above normal rates, essentially profit-sharing from their fertility fraud operations. I studied the ledger and found entries for J. Morrison, James, our former neighbor, Dr. Morrison Stevens. I said, "Can you prove that James Morrison knew what his brother was doing?" I can prove that James received over $200,000 in referral payments from Richard between 1978 and 1985. No legitimate medical referrals would generate that kind of money. She pulled out another document, a handwritten note on Morrison medical letterhead. This is a note from James to Richard, dated June 1983. It says, "The Whitmore family continues to show no signs of suspicion. Margaret appears to believe all 3 children are legitimate. Theodore remains unaware. Recommend maintaining current surveillance protocols." The words hit me like a physical blow. Margaret gasped and covered her mouth with her hands. "Surveillance protocols," Michael said, his voice tight with anger. "They were watching us." For years, Dr. Morrison Stevens confirmed. "James Morrison lived next door to you, specifically to monitor your family. His moving in wasn't a coincidence, it was a strategic placement." Sarah was staring at the document. "What other surveillance protocols?" Dr. Morrison Stevens hesitated, then pulled out a manila envelope. "These are going to be the hardest things for you to see." She spread out a series of photographs. Across the table, they were pictures of our family, at birthday parties, in our backyard, at school events. David's first day of kindergarten, Sarah's high school graduation, Michael's wedding. "They documented your children's entire lives," she said quietly. "They were studying the long-term development of their biological offspring." I picked up one of the photos. It was from David's 8th birthday party in our backyard. I remembered that day clearly, but what I hadn't noticed then was the man, in the background, partially hidden behind a tree, taking pictures. "Who took these?" I asked. "Different people over the years. Sometimes James Morrison himself, sometimes other members of the network, sometimes hired private investigators." Margaret was shaking uncontrollably. "They were always watching us. For 30 years, they were always watching us." "There's something else," Dr. Morrison Stevens said. "Something that's going to be very difficult to process." She pulled out a medical file with David's name on it. "They didn't just watch your children, they occasionally intercepted their medical care. When David broke his arm in 1988, the X were copied and sent to Richard Morrison for analysis. When Sarah had her appendix removed in 1995, tissue samples were taken without authorization and sent to the network for genetic testing." David was reading over the medical file. "Are you saying that doctors we trusted were part of this conspiracy?" "Not all of them, but some of the specialists you were referred to, some of the emergency room doctors who treated your children. Yes, they were part of the network." Michael stood up and started pacing. "This is insane. You're telling us that our entire lives were one big experiment. I'm telling you that Richard Morrison and his associates saw you as valuable research subjects. They wanted to study the long-term outcomes of their genetic material in different family environments." Sarah was looking through more of the photographs. "Dr. Morrison Stevens, how many families were subjected to this level of surveillance?" "We've identified at least 37 families across the 3 states. But we believe there were more families who moved away or whose children haven't discovered the truth yet." I was trying to process the scope of what she was telling us. This wasn't just fertility fraud. This was organized stalking and medical abuse spanning decades. Exactly, and it only stopped in 1987 when several victims came forward simultaneously. and law enforcement started asking questions. The network disbanded, destroyed most of their records, and the surviving members scattered to different states. Margaret looked up from the photographs. How many of the network members are still alive? 3 that I know of. Richard and 2 others are dead. James Morrison is alive and living in Florida under a different name. Dr. Peter Hawthorne is in California, and Dr. Sandra Kellerman, Patricia's aunt, is in Oregon. They're all still practicing medicine? David asked. No, they all quietly retired or had their licenses revoked for various reasons. But none of them ever faced criminal charges for their involvement in the network. I felt a rage building inside me that I'd never experienced before. What do you want from us, Dr. Morrison Stevens? What can we do with this information? I want to expose the entire conspiracy. I want the surviving members prosecuted, and I want justice for all the families they victimized. But I need families like yours to come forward publicly with your stories. Margaret was shaking her head. I can't do that. I can't have our private trauma become public entertainment. It wouldn't be entertainment, it would be justice. And it would help other families who are still dealing with the aftermath of this conspiracy. Sarah spoke up. What would going public involve? Legal testimony, possibly media interviews, cooperation with federal investigators who are now looking into organized medical fraud from that era. I looked around the room at my family. Margaret was terrified at the thought of publicity. David was intrigued by the possibility of bringing the criminals to justice. Sarah seemed torn between wanting privacy and wanting accountability. Michael looked ready to fight. We need time to discuss this as a family, I said finally. Dr. Morrison nodded and started packing up her documents. I understand, but I want you to know that your family's story, with the confession letter, the surveillance documentation, and James Morrison's connection to you, could be the key to finally getting justice for all of Richard Morrison's victims. As she left, I realized that our family was facing the biggest decision of our lives. We could retreat into privacy and try to heal quietly. Or we could step forward and help expose a conspiracy that had destroyed hundreds of lives. Either way, there was no going back to the life we'd known before that DNA test arrived. That evening, our entire family gathered in our living room for what felt like the most important conversation of our lives. Margaret and I sat on the couch, with David, Sarah, and Michael in chairs facing us. The coffee table was covered with all the documents Dr. Morrison Stevens had left with us: photographs, financial records, medical files, and surveillance reports that spanned 3 decades. I keep looking at these pictures, Sarah said, holding up a photo from her wedding day 5 years ago. I remember seeing this man in the background, but I thought he was just another guest I didn't recognize. They were always there, Margaret said quietly. At every important moment in your lives, they were watching and documenting. Michael was reading through the surveillance reports. According to this, they tracked everything: our grades, our relationships, our career choices, even our health records. They treated us like lab rats. The question is, David said, what do we do about it now? I had been wrestling with that question all evening. Dr. Morrison Stevens is asking us to go public, to help her expose the entire conspiracy. But that means giving up our privacy and potentially reliving all this trauma in courtrooms and media interviews. There's something else to consider, Sarah said. What about our children? Emma's 22, and Jake and Sophie are still young. If we go public with this story, it becomes part of their story too. Margaret spoke up. I've been thinking about that. Emma's old enough to understand what happened and make her own decision about how public she wants to be. But Jake and Sophie, They're going to grow up knowing that their grandfather wasn't their biological grandfather. And now they'll also know that their entire family was stalked by criminals for decades. But if we don't go public, Michael said, these people get away with it. James Morrison is living in Florida under a fake name, probably collecting Social Security. Maybe even still practicing medicine in some capacity. The other survivors of the network are out there living normal lives, while we're sitting here trying to piece together the wreckage they left behind. David was scrolling through something on his laptop. I've been researching the legal aspects of this. Dr. Morrison Stevens is right. Statute of limitations has run out for most criminal charges. But there could be federal RICO charges if they can prove it was an organized criminal enterprise. And civil suits could still be filed against the estates and any surviving members. What kind of civil suits? I asked. Compensation for damages, medical monitoring costs, therapy expenses. But more importantly, court orders that would require full disclosure of all victims and all records. Sarah looked thoughtful. So going public wouldn't just be about punishment. It would be about helping other families who still don't know what happened to them. Exactly, Michael said. Dr. Morrison Stevens thinks there could be hundreds of families out there who are still living with unexplained medical conditions, identity confusion, or family secrets because they don't know they're victims of this network. Margaret was quiet for a long time, staring at a photograph of David's first day of school. Finally, she spoke. For 40 years, I've been carrying the shame of what I thought was my secret. I convinced myself that if I just kept quiet and didn't rock the boat, we could all live normal lives. But we haven't been living normal lives, have we? We've been living monitored lives, manipulated lives. Lives that were shaped by criminals who saw us as experimental subjects. She looked up at me with tears in her eyes. Ted, what if there are other women out there right now who are going through what I went through 40 years ago? What if there are other doctors still doing this, and our silence is enabling them? I took her hand. What are you saying, Margaret? I'm saying maybe it's time to stop being victims and start being survivors who fight back. David leaned forward. Mum, are you saying you want to go public? I'm saying I want to think about what's best for everyone, not just our family, but all the families who were hurt by these people. And maybe the only way to really heal from this is to make sure it never happens to anyone else. Michael nodded. I agree. I've been angry for weeks about feeling like a victim, like I had no control over my own story. But we do have control now. We can choose how this story ends. Sarah was still looking at the photographs. If we do this, we do it together. All of us. No one gets pressured into participating if they're not ready. And we set our own terms, I added. We work with Dr. Morrison Stevens and the investigators. But we don't let anyone exploit our story for their own purposes. Margaret squeezed my hand. There's something else I want to say. Ted, for weeks I've been worried that this would destroy our marriage, that learning the truth about the children would change how you feel about me and about them. Margaret, let me finish. But watching how you've handled all of this, seeing how you've stood by us and fought for our family, even when everything you thought you knew was turned upside down, I realize that our love is stronger than any lie they told us. Our family is stronger than any crime they committed against us. I felt tears in my eyes. Margaret, I love you more now than I did 45 years ago when we got married. And I love our children exactly the same as I always have. Biology doesn't create love, choice does. And I choose this family every day. David cleared his throat. So are we really going to do this? Are we going to help Dr. Morrison Stevens expose the network? I looked around the room at my wife and children, this family that had been built on lies but was held together by love and truth. Yes, I said, we're going to do this. But we're going to do it our way, and we're going to do it together. Margaret nodded. Tomorrow, I'm going to call Dr. Morrison Stevens and tell her we're ready to fight back. As we started gathering up the documents, I realized that for the first time since that DNA test arrived, I felt hopeful about the future. We weren't just victims anymore. We were a family that had chosen to stand up for justice. Not just for ourselves, but for all the other families who had been hurt by the Morrison network. Our story wasn't ending with the discovery of the truth. It was beginning with our decision to make sure the truth mattered. 6 months later, I was standing in front of a federal courthouse in Boston, holding Margaret's hand as we walked up the steps together. Behind us, David, Sarah, and Michael were surrounded by reporters asking questions about the case that had become known as the Morrison Network conspiracy. Dr. Morrison Stevens had been right. Our family's story had become the keystone that brought down a criminal organization that had operated for nearly 20 years. James Morrison had been arrested in Florida and was facing federal racketeering charges. The other surviving members of the network had been indicted on charges ranging from medical fraud to conspiracy to commit assault. But more importantly, the investigation had led to the discovery of 247 families who had been victimized by the network. The database Dr. Morrison Stevens had been building for years had grown exponentially as more victims came forward after our story became public. "How are you feeling?" I asked Margaret as we paused at the courthouse entrance. "Nervous, relieved, proud," she said. "Mostly proud of how our family has handled all this. The past 6 months had been difficult but healing. We'd testified before grand juries, participated in victim impact statements, and worked with federal investigators to piece together the full scope of the network's crimes. But we'd also found our way back to each other as a family. David had become something of an unofficial coordinator for Morrison's biological children, helping dozens of half-siblings connect with each other. He'd found purpose in using his analytical skills to help other families navigate the complex emotions of discovering their true origins. Sarah had channeled her artistic talents into creating a memorial garden for victims of medical fraud. She'd also become an advocate for stronger informed consent laws, working with legislators to prevent future cases of fertility fraud. Michael had struggled the most with the public attention, but he'd found healing in helping other men who discovered they weren't the biological fathers of children they'd raised. He'd started a support group that met monthly and had helped dozens of families work through similar crises. Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore, a young woman with a press badge, approached us. "I'm Jessica Chen from the Boston Globe. Could I ask you a few questions about today's sentencing?" I looked at Margaret, and she nodded. We'd agreed to speak publicly about our experience, believing that silence had protected the criminals for too long. "What do you hope comes out of today's proceedings?" the reporter asked. Margaret stepped forward. "We hope that James Morrison and the other members of this network finally face consequences for their actions. But more than that, we hope that other families who were hurt by these people can begin to heal." "How has this experience changed your family?" I thought about the question carefully. It's taught us that families aren't defined by biology, they're defined by love, commitment, and choice. Our children are no less our children because of what we've learned. If anything, we're closer now than we've ever been. What would you say to other families who might be dealing with similar discoveries? Sarah, who had joined us at the microphone, answered, "Don't let shame or fear keep you silent. There are people who understand what you're going through, and there are resources available to help. Most importantly, remember that learning the truth about your origins doesn't change who you are as a person or as a family. Inside the courthouse, we took our seats in the gallery as James Morrison was brought in for sentencing. He was 78 years old now, frail and grey, nothing like the friendly neighbor I remembered from 40 years ago. When he looked back at the victim families in the gallery, his eyes found ours, and I saw something I hadn't expected: regret. During the victim impact portion of the hearing, Margaret stood up to address the court. "Your Honor, for over 40 years, I carried the shame and confusion of what I thought was my secret. I blamed myself for being naive, for trusting the wrong person, for not protecting my family from deception. But I've learned that shame belongs to the perpetrators, not the victims." Her voice was strong and clear as she continued. James Morrison didn't just help his brother commit medical fraud. He invaded our lives, stalked our family, and turned our most intimate moments into surveillance opportunities. He stole our privacy, our sense of security, and our right to raise our children without being watched and documented. She paused, looking directly at Morrison. "But he didn't steal our love for each other. He didn't steal our family bonds, and he didn't steal our ability to choose forgiveness and healing over bitterness and destruction." When Margaret sat back down, I felt a pride in her that was even deeper than what I'd felt on our wedding day. She had transformed from a victim into a survivor, and from a survivor into an advocate. The judge sentenced James Morrison to 12 years in federal prison, effectively a life sentence given his age. The other network members received sentences ranging from 5 to 15 years, and their estates were ordered to pay millions in restitution to victims. As we walked out of the courthouse that day, surrounded by other victim families who had become our extended community, Emma ran up and hugged me. "How do you feel, Grandpa Ted?" I looked at this young woman, who was technically not my biological granddaughter, but was absolutely my granddaughter in every way that mattered. I thought about the journey our family had taken from that devastating DNA test result to this moment of justice and healing. "I feel like we got our story back," I said. "For 40 years, other people controlled our story, decided what we knew and when we knew it. Today, we took control of our own narrative." Margaret smiled and took my arm. "And our story isn't about being victims of medical fraud. Our story is about being a family who chose love over biology, truth over secrets, and justice over silence." As we walked away from the courthouse together, me and Margaret, David and Jennifer, Sarah and Tom, Michael and Lisa, and all the grandchildren who would grow up knowing the truth about their origins, I realized that our family's story had indeed ended exactly where it should have, not with the revelation of lies, but with the triumph of love. Not with the discovery of crimes, but with the choice to seek justice. Not with shame and secrecy, but with pride and truth. We were the Whitmore family, and that had never been more true than it was right now.